In the autumn of 1888, Scotland Yard received a letter. It was written in red ink. It began, "Dear Boss," and it ended with a name that would become the most famous alias in the history of crime: Jack the Ripper. The Whitechapel murders of 1888 are the most written about unsolved crimes in history. Thousands of books, hundreds of documentary films, an entire industry of speculation, theory, and obsession that has now been running for over 130 years. And yet, the case was never solved. The killer was never identified. The file at Scotland Yard was never officially closed. But here is what most of those books and documentaries don't tell you. The Ripper case is not primarily a story about a killer. It is a story about a detective force, young, underfunded, operating without the tools we take for granted, that was handed the most watched criminal investigation in the world, and had to conduct it in real time, in public, under a press that was inventing modern crime journalism as it went. This is the story of what Scotland Yard actually did, what they found, what they missed, and why 130 years later, the answer is still missing. To understand the Ripper investigation, you first need to understand what Scotland Yard was in 1888. The Metropolitan Police had existed for less than 60 years. The Criminal Investigation Department, the plainclothes detective branch, had been created only 10 years earlier, in 1878, following a corruption scandal that had nearly destroyed the previous detective unit entirely. The CID in 1888 had around 250 officers covering
the entirety of London. The Whitechapel Division, H Division, was responsible for one of the most densely populated and most socially complex areas in the city. Its resources were stretched before the murders began. When they began, they became catastrophic. The press response to the Whitechapel murders was unlike anything London journalism had produced before. The Times, the Daily Telegraph, the Star, the Evening News, all of them covered every development in obsessive detail, often publishing information that compromised the investigation, sometimes publishing information that was entirely fabricated. The reporters who followed the Ripper case invented techniques that modern crime journalism still uses: staking out police stations, cultivating informants within the investigation, pressuring officials for comment on developments they had not yet confirmed. They also invented the practice of publishing anonymous letters claiming to be from the killer, a practice that generated enormous public interest and made the actual investigation considerably harder to conduct. The lead investigator on the Ripper case was a man named Frederick Aberline. He was 52 years old, had 14 years of experience specifically in the East End, spoke the local dialect, and knew the geography of Whitechapel with the intimacy of someone who had worked it for most of his professional life. Aberline was not the glamorous detective of Victorian fiction. He was a careful, methodical man who had built his career on local knowledge and patient investigation. He had no forensic laboratory, no fingerprint database, no photographic evidence beyond the crime scene photographs that were taken for the first time during this very investigation. What he had was 2,000 witness statements, more than 300 suspects, a team of officers who had been working
18-hour days since August, and a public that was demanding an arrest he could not make because he did not have the evidence to support one. The investigation produced, over the course of the autumn of 1888, several moments that felt like breakthroughs and proved not to be. A witness named Israel Schwartz reported seeing a man assault a woman near the site of one of the murders shortly before the body was discovered. His description, a man of medium height, age about 30, with a small fair mustache, was consistent with several suspects, but conclusive about none. A leather apron found near one crime scene was seized by police and publicized as a significant clue. It led to the arrest and rapid release of a Jewish bootmaker named John Pizer, whose alibi was solid and whose connection to the murders was non-existent. The incident inflamed anti-Semitic tensions in the East End that were already dangerously high and complicated the investigation's ability to gather information from the local community. The double event of the 30th of September, two murders in a single night in different locations, demonstrated something disturbing. The killer was operating with a freedom of movement that the increased police presence in Whitechapel had not constrained. Officers had been stationed throughout the area. The murders happened anyway. The letters are the part of the Ripper case that has attracted the most attention, generated the most controversy, and contributed the most confusion to any attempt to understand what actually happened. Scotland Yard received hundreds of letters during the autumn of 1888 claiming to be from the Whitechapel killer. The vast majority were immediately identified as hoaxes, but 3 letters, the Dear Boss letter,
The Saucy Jackie postcard, and the From Hell letter were treated more seriously, at least initially. The Dear Boss letter, received on the 27th of September and passed to police by the Central News Agency, was the first to use the name Jack the Ripper. Its tone was mocking, confident, and specific in ways that initially suggested genuine insider knowledge. Later analysis, including by the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit, which reviewed the Ripper case in the 1980s, concluded that the Dear Boss letter was almost certainly a journalistic hoax, probably written by a news agency employee seeking to generate the story of the decade. The name Jack the Ripper, which would define the case for over a century, was in all likelihood invented by a journalist. The From Hell letter, received in October with half of a preserved kidney, described in the letter as having been fried and eaten, is considered by most serious researchers to be more likely genuine, or at least sent by someone with direct knowledge of the murder of Catherine Eddowes, from whose body a kidney had been removed. The contrast between the two letters, the polished, articulate Dear Boss letter and the nearly illiterate From Hell letter, suggests to many researchers that they were written by different people, which means that either the Ripper himself wrote one and a journalist wrote the other, or both were fabrications, or neither was. By November 1888, when Mary Jane Kelly was murdered in her room at Miller's Court, in what appears to have been the most sustained and deliberate of all the Whitechapel killings, the investigation had been running for 3 months, had generated more than 2,000 witness statements, had considered more than 300 suspects, and had produced no arrest. The Home Secretary at the time, Henry Matthews, was under enormous parliamentary pressure to produce results. He resisted calls to offer a reward, believing, probably correctly, that rewards in high-profile cases generated false information. But the political pressure on Scotland Yard was real and affected the investigation in ways that investigators found difficult. Commissioner Charles Warren resigned in November 1888, technically over a dispute about newspaper interviews, but actually because the political environment around the Ripper investigation had become untenable. His departure added instability to an investigation that was already under strain. Aberline continued. He would later say, in retirement, that he believed he knew who the Ripper was. He named a man named Severin Klosowski, also known as George Chapman, a Polish barber who would later be convicted and hanged for poisoning 3 wives. Aberline's theory has its supporters and its critics, and ultimately proves nothing, because Aberline's belief was not supported by evidence sufficient for prosecution. What does the Scotland Yard record of the Ripper investigation actually tell us? It tells us that the investigation was, within the constraints of its time and resources, conducted more carefully than its public reputation. Failed. Not because of incompetence or corruption, because the forensic revolution that would eventually make cases like this solvable was still 20 years away. The case remains open. The theories continue, the books and documentaries will continue, and somewhere in the Scotland Yard archives, in a box that has been examined by researchers for over a century, the evidence that would have been enough in 1888 lies beside the evidence that would be more than enough today. What we can say is this: the investigation of the Whitechapel murders of 1888 was the moment that modern criminal investigation,
systematic, evidence-based, documented, and subject to public scrutiny, began in Britain. It failed to catch the killer, but in failing, publicly, under the most intense examination any investigation had ever received, it established the framework for everything that came after. Every cold case review, every forensic database, every systematic approach to witness management and evidence cataloging. These things exist partly because of what Scotland Yard did not have in 1888, and what everyone could see it did not have. The Ripper made modern policing necessary, and in that strange and specific...
The way the most famous unsolved case in history produced more change than most solved ones. If the hidden history of crime, justice, and the birth of modern detection matters to you, subscribe. Every week, we find the cases that changed everything. Next week, the Victorian poisoners, the women who discovered that arsenic was tasteless, untraceable, and freely available at every pharmacy in Britain. See you then.